Welcome. My name is Sherry Kling. I'm the director of Process and Faith, which is a program of the Center for Process Studies. Jared Morningstar is also with us this evening from the Center for Process Studies in PNF. He's doing Zoom support. And in a moment, I will introduce our speaker and topic for the evening. But I just want to first say welcome. I also want to mention that in 1 week from tonight, we're beginning a course with Bruce on exploring global mysticism through a process lens. And we'll get that link in the chat at some point soon, and you can go to that page if you're interested. Now, that in that course will be Bruce will be again leading us in learning there, and he'll be focusing on four mystics. So there are probably going to be more segments of this kind of course going forward because we've got a lot of mystics that Bruce can talk about. So he's written books on several, and anyway, that's just a great topic that I know people are often very interested in. And what's wonderful is the course isn't just limited to the sort of like Western Christian mystics that we're used to hearing about in the Christian tradition, but includes some other folks as well, like Eddie Hillesum. So anyway, well, without further ado, let us begin our program for this evening. Again, welcome. So tonight we are here to hear about the God of the Growing Edge, looking at Alfred North Whitehead and Howard Thurman on theology, spirituality, and social change. And our teacher for this evening is Bruce Epperly, who is so much well known and much loved in the process community. And he's spent many decades in the multi-vocational pathway of being both in ministry and also an academic. And so he's also been a university chaplain. He's got many books, over 60 books on in the areas of theology, spirituality, and health and healing, scripture, politics, and ministry. And he's, I think, probably one of the best translators of Whitehead and process theology. And I don't mean language translator, but an interpreter that is so accessible as compared to Alfred North Whitehead's work himself. And I see we have a Christopher Whitehead among us. Christopher, are you a relation to the Alfred North Whitehead family? That would be pretty cool. And if not, welcome anyway. But anyway, with that, let me welcome Dr. Bruce Epperly, and welcome to all of you. And Bruce, you want to get started and jump on in?
Okay. It is good to be with you tonight. I always begin a conversation with the saying from the Psalms. This is the day that God has made, and we will rejoice and be glad in it. Because it's a joy to be with you today. And tonight I'm going just to speak both personally and theologically, as well as make some contact with the world in which we live today. It is a great joy to share about two theologians slash philosophers who've guided my journey, both of whom I discovered in 1972-73 as a college student. And it amazes me to ponder, and this perhaps is the privilege of a person who's in their seventh decade. I didn't know, Sherry, when you started reeling in the decades, how many you'd add to me, but a person in their second decade, to look back at where you've been and look back at the 20-year-old self who discovered Whitehead and Teilhard and Plato and Thurman, and to some extent Jesus, all in the same semester in college, and never looked back. And I want to begin, as I did in another class recently, I was teaching on Howard Thurman, to bring a candle to our time. And Thurman wrote about a variety of things, and he loved Christmas. And this is a Christmas poem, but it's appropriate to our time because, of course, both Whitehead and Thurman are Christmas theologians. The world lives by the incarnation of God, Whitehead says. And Thurman wrote greatly on Christmas. But listen to these, probably written in a troubled time. Probably written in a troubled time. I will light candles this Christmas, candles of joy, despite all the sadness, candles of hope where despair keeps watch, candles of courage for fears are ever present, candles of peace for tempest-tossed days, candles of grace to ease heavy burdens, candles of love to inspire all my living, candles that will burn all year long. So we light a candle, the candle that needs both the shadow and the light, because of course the shadow is very fecund too, but the candle of light in a time in which many are troubled. And of course, as we'll see, at least as I'll interpret Whitehead and Thurman, both of them lived in troubled times. And both of them, there's probably all times are joyful and troubled, to be honest. And both of them tried to bring some healing to the times in which they lived. I want to begin with two quotes. The first from Whitehead's Adventures of Ideas, which you haven't read that, I commend it to you. To me, it just is a beautiful book. I was reading through it today for another project. I'm looking at notes that I've been taking on this same book I got 50 years ago and how I've lived with this book and probably read it in one form or another 50 times. The vigor of civilized societies is preserved by the widespread sense that high aims are worthwhile. Vigorous societies harbor a certain extravagance of objectives so that people wander beyond the safe provision of personal gratifications. The perfection of life begins and resides in aims beyond the individual person in question. High aims are worthwhile, and perfection takes us beyond ourselves. And then a poem. Again, is from Christmas, but it pertains to the whole year, by Thurman. Look well to the growing edge. All around us, worlds are dying, and new worlds are being born. All around us, life is dying, and life is being reborn. The fruit ripens on the tree. The roots are silently at work in the darkness of the earth against a time when there shall be new leaves, fresh blossoms, green fruit. Such is the growing edge. It is the extra breath from the exhausted lung. The one more thing to try when all else has failed. The upward reach of life when weariness closes in upon all endeavor. This is the basis of hope in moments of despair. The incentive to carry on when times are out of joint and people have lost their reason. The source of confidence when worlds crash and dreams whiten into ash. The birth of a child, life's most dramatic answer to death. This is the growing edge incarnate. Look well to the growing edge. Look well to the growing edge. I'm going to talk a moment about my relationship with Whitehead and Thurman, because indeed every theologian or spiritual guide is in many ways writing from their experience. Certainly they should. And both Whitehead and Thurman privilege experience. Neither one of them liked doctrine that well. Neither of them liked dogmatism at all. Every morning, and this has been a practice I've done for the past few years, I recall my good ancestors. That's a Yoruban, African Ifa concept. As part of my pre-dawn walk, and I invoke friends who have passed on. I invoke my teachers. I've recently added John Cobb to my good ancestors list every morning, along with David Griffin. I invoke Whitehead and Thurman, who've been my companions intellectually and spiritually for over 5 decades. It was 1970s. I was a college student, and we were still in the heart of the Vietnam War. And in the course of 1 year, 72, 73, I discovered both Whitehead and Thurman, along with Teilhard, Plato, and Francis, and a new understanding of God and Jesus. I learned Whitehead initially from Marie Fox in the philosophy department at San Jose State. She never wrote anything. I've been trying. She's probably passed on, but she's one of my good ancestors. If you look on Google Marie Fox, you won't find anything. She barely wrote a thing, but she was filled with the spirit of Plato and Whitehead. She channeled them, we might say. And in the religious studies department was Richard Keedy, recently passed away from Alzheimer's. He was a recent graduate of Claremont, a student of John Cobb. I initially got to know Howard Thurman from another figure in town, the Baptist College chaplain, the legendary Shorty Collins. They called him Shorty, and as you recall, nowadays we don't usually describe people by their physiognomy or their stature. But they called Shorty because he was 6'5". A bit of irony there, I suppose. And he was a friend of Howard Thurman for 50 years. Shorty introduced Thurman to Olive Schreiner, the South African feminist and freedom seeker, at one of the retreats of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is the oldest peace group. My faith at the time was primarily activist. I just discovered Jesus again. I was raised a Baptist, and that led me to dispose of Jesus somewhere in my pre-teens. You know, when Baptists go south, they go south big time. And I discovered Christianity again when I learned transcendental meditation in the October of 1970 as a college first-year student and started going back to church again, thankfully to a progressive-oriented Baptist church whose theology was mostly social gospel. I didn't know anything about Christian mysticism. The only mysticism I really knew was Buddhist and Hindu at the time. But Thurman came to our church to speak, and here I am probably a junior in college. And I started devouring everything he read. I went to the college library at San Jose State and got everything and borrowed books. And of course, in those days, and I have a few old Thurman books from the early 70s that I got at the used bookstore for $0.25. Those were the days for book buyers. Again, from Whitehead and Teilhard and Thurman and Plato, I learned a worldview, a God I could believe in. From Thurman, I discovered the heart of Christian spirituality and mysticism. Now, there's a little synchronicity here, as the Jungians say. I'm a firm adherent to the notion of synchronicity, meaningful coincidence. Although we didn't know each other at the time, we met in 1978 and married the next year, and our matchmaker, interestingly enough, was Catherine Keller, well-known process theologian. My wife, Kate, had gone about the same time to a retreat led by Howard Thurman, sponsored by her spiritual mentor, Alan Armstrong Hunter, who was Thurman's other best white friend. And both of them appear more than anyone else, actually, as much as King, I think, in Thurman's autobiography with Head and Heart. And so Thurman's been a part of our lives for 50 some years now. Now, a bit of theology. As we look at Thurman and Whitehead, they viewed theology and philosophy, and Whitehead does philosophy in the grand fashion, the grand fashion of trying to fathom the universe and trying to look for purpose in the universe and trying to look for meaning in the universe. Both of them had a sense of the eternal present in the temporal, the infinite in the finite, in the concrete. And they traveled the universe and yet were concerned with this present moment. Both of them were concerned about the life and times in which they lived. You'll see that most especially in the dialogues with Alfred North Whitehead by Lucian Price, which it really relates about how in touch with current affairs Whitehead was and how he had significant thoughts about what was going on politically at the time. Both of them were intellectual giants. And although he doesn't put it at the forefront in his writings, Whitehead was shaped by World War I and World War II. He was shaped by the death of his son, Eric. As a young man, young academic, he was a leader in the women's suffrage movement in England and did something fairly radical for the England of his time. He worked to get middle-class students in college. That was a big deal then because the class system was pretty significant in England at that time. Thurman, in contrast, was described as the Black Pilgrim, the author of what is probably the first Black theology, Jesus and the Disinherited. The first Black theology, written about 1948, Jesus and the Disinherited. Both of them saw his theology and history, I should say, as directed by the aim at beauty and justice. Both of them saw the world as adventurous. I think of Howard Thurman's comment, and you can just find this in Whitehead if you looked for it. God is an adventurer, and those who affirm their fraternity must follow in God's train. God is an adventurer, and those who affirm their fraternity must follow in God's train. And Thurman, to my knowledge, was the first person to use the term holy adventure. Later on, I published a book by that name, but Thurman uses it in one of his Christmas books. God calls us forward and not backward. God is the restless spirit and not the sanction of the status quo. Now, they had an asymmetrical relationship. Whitehead was born in 1861, Thurman in 1899. Whitehead probably didn't know anything about Howard Thurman. It's just, there's nothing in his writings that would reflect that. Thurman knew about Whitehead, and he quotes Whitehead once at least. And I'm grateful to Anthony Hunt, who teaches at St. Mary's School of Theology in Baltimore, for finding his quote for me, in which he talks about Whitehead's notion that religion is what an individual does with their solitude. Put briefly, for Thurman and Whitehead, God is the growing edge in a world of conflict and injustice. And it invites us, in the title of another of my books on Whitehead and Teilhard, to seek a God of tomorrow, to seek a God of tomorrow, a God of stature, a God of size. And so we need Whitehead and Thurman to give us a dream of large-souled people. Both Whitehead and Thurman challenged small-spirited religion. Religion should be big. Religion should be grand. It should produce us A friend of many of us, Patricia Adams Farmer, says fat souls, big souls. You don't want a small religion. You don't want a small philosophy. You don't want a small politics. Bernie Loomer, who was a student of Whitehead and who knew Thurman, since they both were in the Berkeley area about the same time, Thurman was in San Francisco, Loomer across the bay in Berkeley, talks about stature. How big, the size of your faith, the size of your life. And there's a beautiful poem that Thurman uses in his autobiography. We don't know who wrote it. Each night, my bonny, sturdy lad persists in adding to his "now I lay me down to sleep" the earnest and wistful plea, "God make me big." And I, his mother, with greater need, do echo in a humble and contrite heart, "God make me big." God make me big. That's the growing edge. If you've ever read much Whitehead or Thurman, the one thing you see about them is a big world, right? Whitehead says that philosophy can't exclude anything. Philosophy has to look for evidence everywhere, and I believe that's the case for religion as well. Both of them presented an alternative vision to the world in which they lived. It's interesting, they were very different people. Whitehead was born to the manor. His family wasn't wealthy, but he was the son and grandson of Episcopalian priests, and he was among the intellectual elite. And he had a clear course either to the ministry or the academy growing up. And those were both positions that had a good deal of status in those days. Thurman, however, was born in Jim Crow South. He was born in Daytona Beach, Florida, if you know where Daytona Beach is. In the days of separate and unequal, the days in which lynchings were not uncommon, the days in which Black people were seen as only slightly better than beasts, in which slavery was still a reality. Thurman was blessed to have a mother and a grandmother that nurtured him. His grandmother, who grew up an enslaved person, reminded him of two alternative realities, and they shaped Thurman the rest of his life. Quite often, the slave master would come in and preach to the enslaved people and say, "Slaves, obey your master." That was the heart of the gospel. Yet, an enslaved preacher would come every so often, and they'd steal away to Jesus. Any of you know that hymn, "Steal Away to Jesus"? You know, they'd steal away to Jesus for a couple hours, and he'd say to them, "You are not slaves. You are the children of God." Both of them were shaped by tragedy. Whitehead was shaped by the death of his son Eric, an aviator in World War I, and the death of a whole generation of students of his at Cambridge. Imagine that. You think of the killing fields in Gaza. Well, there were killing fields in Europe at that time where people fought over just 100 yards of land, and they'd be there for ages, and the soldiers, whole generation of English and Scottish and Irish and French and Germans died in that war. It shaped Whitehead, and some people would suggest, and I'm one of them, that Whitehead, reflecting back on the war, realized there was more to life than mathematics. and more to life than logic, that he needed to find some notion in which beauty mattered, in which greatness was preserved, in which love never ended. In Whiteheadian language, that might be the primordial nature of God and the consequent nature of God. Love never ends. So Eric Whitehead lives on, at the very least, in the divine experience, at the very least. Both of them were critical of religion. You all know that famous phrase from Whitehead. When the Western world accepted Christianity, Caesar conquered. The brief Galilean vision of humility flickered throughout the ages uncertainly. In the official formulation of religion, it is assumed the trivial form of a mere attribution to the Jews that they cherished a misconception about their Messiah. But the deeper idolatry of fashioning of a god in the image of an Egyptian, Persian, and Roman imperial rulers was retained. The church gave unto God the attributes which belonged exclusively to Caesar. That's pretty harsh, isn't it? And there's a good deal of truth to that. There's a good deal of truth to it. And in personality, Thurman and Whitehead were both quite similar. They were soft-spoken. They weren't prone to rant about anything. They were very soft-spoken, gentle people. But here are these words from Thurman. The world is not finished yet. Yet that men do worship God, yes. And the gods they worship are unworthy gods. The tragedy of life is that persons become like the gods they worship. These are not atheists. People become like the gods they worship. If they are bad persons, it means they're worshiping bad gods. And of course, Whitehead, in a statement that could be in the 21st century, said, I should say Thurman, a statement that could refer to the 21st century. When I meet a white Christian, I do not know what their attitude toward me will be. That's a pretty tough statement, isn't it, for a person of color to say? Now, think a moment, and I want to bring us in here for a conversation. We have Whitehead and Caesar both being critical of images of God, right? Have you ever encountered bad gods? Have you ever encountered bad gods, and what were they like? Anyone want to hazard a guess or a thought? If not, I'm going to pick on Clarence. Clarence White here. I want to give Clarence a shout out. Clarence is one of my best intellectual buddies. And Clarence is probably more prolific as a writer than I am. And I do take credit, though, Clarence, for telling you should write books of about 50 pages in length. Good books about that length. And Clarence has written several. Go look on Amazon. They're priced reasonably. He's written some great books in the last couple of years, Clarence White. So, Clarence, have you ever encountered a bad God?
Yes, I, in fact, I'm writing about this now
Why do you think
because
I
I'm
asked you?
writing a book about things I've changed my mind about.
Yeah.
I spent 10 years in a religious cult, and I was given a picture of God that was mean and harsh and exacting. And we were told that this cult leader took the verse about deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me and basically threw out the rest of the New Testament. And he would say things like self can never be permitted to make a decision again in your life. And it made me feel like we were bad people because of that. Um, I heard a story one time about a preacher who said to his audience, the only difference between you and a bucket of slop is the bucket. That doesn't help anything, folks. That was a bad God. So that's my example.
A bad God. Where else have you seen the impact of bad gods? Anyone want a hazard? Yeah, Rick.
Yes. Uh, a God that does not allow freedom of interpretation on the part of the created beings. If the doctrine or the belief is so closed that creation is not becoming new every day,
Yes.
then individuals within creation do not have freedom. And if they don't have freedom, they don't have the ability to interpret and to respond to the possibilities that run their way. And they can't create creative, open communities.
A God who doesn't like freedom, a God who doesn't like agency, a God for whom it's my way or the highway. No, it's interesting. Um, and there are times in which we probably need to follow the directions. Uh, but
And
my
John
wife was
and Bruce, John Otto had his hand raised. It looked like he wanted
okay. I'll get to you, John, and I'm looking for your face somewhere. Um, let me see. But the service was all about obedience, all about obedience. But there's more to faith than obedience, isn't there? And it's usually the obedience of strict rules. So, Mr. Otto, where are you?
Yeah, my experience of bad gods are good gods that I've outgrown. Um, and I think it's true of our people in general. The original God of Israel was an ethnocentric, uh, henotheistic God.
Mm-hmm.
It worked fine until they discovered that their God was a God that called them to be related to all others. Their God was the God of all people. And then their old God became a God in which they were stuck and they were unable to relate to others. And I experienced many Americans that their God is basically a national reality.
Okay.
Uh, that God once was the God of all peoples, but now that God does not serve the well being of humankind. It becomes a bad God.
Okay. A God that's too small, a God that's too parochial.
A God that was once adequate, but no longer is.
Yes. Isn't that the truth, John Otto? Um, Certainly, Whitehead talks religion in the making. I commend the book to you. It's the closest. Whitehead has a poetic sense. It's hard to believe for some of you that Whitehead has a poetic sense. I could I could sit with a gin and tonic on the beach in Florida, reading Religion in the Making any day, maybe a margarita too. But I will tell you, he says the comment, you begin with God, the enemy. You must obey or else. And the God that's parochial and transactional. And then it evolves to the God that you imitate because God's goodness is greater than your own. And Whitehead talks there about the evolution from individualistic parochial gods to world loyalty. We're still working on that one, aren't we? We're still working on that. And America is, United States of America is not the only country that succumbs to this, by the way. A country can substitute itself and its well-being for the well-being of the planet. Um, The fact of the matter is, even though countries need borders and laws and things like that, I'm all in favor of those. God's children live everywhere. And my neighbor across the seas is loved by God as much as my own two grandchildren. My neighbor coming up from South America is loved by God. My neighbor in Gaza. My neighbor is the MAGA hat. Again, there is a sense in which Whitehead and Thurman had a great belief in the reverence of life. You know, value is at the heart of Whitehead's vision, isn't it? Whatever can experience is valuable. This is a story that Whitehead would have resonated to if he had heard it. And I know a couple of you have heard this because I've told it to you, but everybody tells a story more than once. But when Thurman was a young boy growing up in Daytona Beach, Florida, he was hired to rake leaves by a local business person. And I don't know about you, but I love to kick leaves. Anyone here love to kick leaves? I still do if I see them on the side of the road, not in somebody's yard. I stay off my neighbor's yards. But if on the side of the road, I just love to kick right through them. Call me a sinner. Call me a leaf kicker. This girl keeps the businessman's daughter keeps knocking over the leaves. And since Thurman was paid probably 50 cents for an afternoon's work, maybe even less in those days, he finally gets angry at her and says, "I'm going to tell your father." And again, this is about 1910. She gets a stick pin. I don't know if you know what those are. You used to put them in your hat to keep it on. And she pokes him in the arm. And he squeals. And she says, "Howard, what are you doing squealing? You can't feel. You can't feel." The one thing that Whitehead and Thurman have in common is feeling. Feelings are at the heart of the universe for Whitehead, aren't they? And feelings are at the heart of the universe for Thurman, not just the feelings of people we like, but feelings of people we don't like. When we talk more at length about Thurman next week, we'll talk about how he was what one might describe a mystical social activist. And he believed it was important not only to protest injustice because God desires that each of us have abundant life, and God is opposed to anything that stands in the way of justice for everyone, but we also have to, even as we protest the injustice of the oppressor, see the divine in the oppressor. The oppressor can feel too, right? A world of feelings is a world in which we, the best we can, revere the life of the other. Revere the life of the painful person in great pain who believes that perhaps immigrants are our problem and our biggest problem. Or the person in great pain because they're an immigrant and anxious about their lives right now. The Israeli mother whose child was killed on October 7th, and the Gaza mother whose children are being hidden in the rubble every day through bombing. They can feel, right? A universe of feeling. Whatever can feel for both Whitehead and Thurman, whatever can feel has value. And whatever has value deserves ethical consideration. Does that make sense? Whatever can feel has value. Whatever has value has an experience deserves ethical consideration. Again, Whitehead was a precursor to Mother Teresa in many ways. And Mother Teresa, says, do something beautiful for God. And how do we do something beautiful for God? We do something beautiful for our neighbor. Both Thurman and Whitehead was much more articulate about this than Thurman. Thurman didn't like being called a theologian. He didn't like being called a theologian because he identified too often theologians with dogma. But those of them believed in the universality of experience and that whatever experiences are valuable. One more thing, and then I'm going to pause a moment for questions or comments. And both Thurman and Whitehead loved the arts. For Whitehead, it was the poetry primarily. He loved the romantic poets like Wordsworth, the 19th century romantic poets. For Thurman, it was not only good literature, it was gospel music, it was spirituals. Now, I'm a big fan of spirituals, and if you want to read two books that Thurman wrote on spirituals, they're short books. You can read them in an afternoon. Deep River and The Negro Spiritual Speaks of Life and Death. They're in one volume. You can get it online. They quite possibly are among the most articulate theological studies of spirituals. That spirituals, and we know this. I know there's some musicians here, and you can speak to that better than I. But there's some musicians here who know how a good song can get you through a tough time. I mean, in a troubled time, and I'll just only indirectly deal with the political situation. As long as you have a song in your heart, they can't defeat you. As long as you have a song in your heart, they can't defeat you, whomever they happen to be. And the value of life, again, Thurman gives us a wonderful story of that. You know, think of a song, I've got shoes, you've got shoes, all of God's children got shoes. We're going to walk around in heaven our shoes. I could preach this stuff. I could preach this stuff. When you've got shoes, it means you matter, don't you? If you're a slave. Or Deep River, my home is on the other side. That doesn't just have to do with heaven. It has to do with going over the river into Ohio, having freedom. The arts were important to them. So I'll pause for some time for conversation. Any questions or comments thus far? Yes, Dan.
Yeah, hi, Bruce. Um, you talked about Whitehead was involved with suffrage.
Yes.
Any idea why he never commented, or at least what I'm aware of, he never commented on the black situation in the South?
That's a good question. I have a feeling that, like many Northerners, and he was a Northerner in the United States, he was ignorant in that area. Let me just be honest. His theology, Dan, and philosophy would incline him to be an activist, or at least believe in the value of all people and the importance of all people. You can see the same problem in the social gospel movement of people like Walter Rauschenbusch, if you've ever heard of him, is that the social gospel movement was at least initially a Northern movement and spent most of its energy on industry and life in the cities and very little on civil rights. And I simply think, Dan, that it was a blind spot. He makes one interesting comment about Gandhi and Lord Mountbatten as both people of great stature, which would enable will eventually lead to the freedom of India. And to some degree, you know, we're all creatures of our time, and that was not on the radar for most people who were white at that time, to be honest. Again, 1924 to 34 was when he did most of his writing. And even if you look at Roosevelt's New Deal, it was acted almost as if African Americans didn't exist. I mean, there is good reason to call slavery and our treatment of persons of color America's original sin. Having said that, and not letting Whitehead off the hook, I believe that had he been around 30 years later, his view would have been publicly very different, Dan. In the same way as he doesn't write about ecology because, in quotes, it wasn't an issue then. But of course, John Cobb, one of my good ancestors, over 50 years ago now, wrote the first book, full-length book on ecology, Is It Too Late? Using process principles. And Thurman alludes just briefly to the environment in one of his writings. Again, he died in 1981 when the environmental movement was just getting its start. Dan, I think we're all creatures of our times.
Oh, yeah, that's very true. But thank you.
Other thoughts and questions? Rick.
You mentioned loyalty. I've never connected. What was the term? Nature loyalty?
World loyalty.
Yeah, world loyalty.
Sherry, we should sing a duet. World loyalty.
The reason I read a lot. I've been reading a lot in Josiah Rice,
Yes.
And his notion of loyalty and the beloved community, from which loyalty to loyalty is central, and an ongoing community of interpretation as possibilities are interpreted and shared. Yes. And then creating new communities in which what Royce called the interpreter spirit can grow yes. within a community. And so what is loyalty in terms of Whitehead's understanding?
Okay. He doesn't fully unpack it. And of course, in Royce's majestic Problem of Christianity, 2 volumes, he unpacks, and also his book on loyalty, he unpacks it ad nauseum in many ways, and doesn't get the credit that he deserves in originating the term the beloved community. Whitehead would have been aware of Royce. I'll just say that because they were both, he was aware of the philosophic world. To my knowledge, he didn't quote Royce, and I stand corrected if I'm wrong there. I'm just going back in my Rolodex of memories. For him, it is, might say, self-transcendence, stature, getting out of yourself. He has a wonderful chapter, Whitehead does, in Adventures of Ideas it's titled Peace. I think there are 2 or 3 paragraphs in that chapter which are simply lovely. And he talks about the peace as being this, when the self is lost to a greater self.
Yeah.
And loyalty for Whitehead is baked into his philosophy, because Whitehead is a philosopher of interdependence and relationships, just as Royce was. A philosopher of interdependence, of relationships. We're all connected. Ubuntu, we're all connected. I am because of you. We are because of one another. But we want to have larger and larger circles of concern. I mean, if there is a danger in Christianity of which I won't call it evangelical Christianity, because to some degree I am an evangelical Christian, so I'm not going to give them that language. I have a personal relationship with Jesus. I'll make that confession. I pray to Jesus, so that in my personal prayers. So I'm not going to give away that term. I'll call it conservative Christians. If there's a problem with conservative Christianity, it's bought the transactional nature of individualism. If I do this, I get that. If I believe in God, I'll be saved. If I don't, I'm damned. And becomes then a way of dealing with everything else in life, right? We can see the transactional nature of faith living out in politics. You do this for me, I'll do that for you. We can do it in business. For Whitehead, and I believe also for Thurman, because both of them believed that we were called to be bigger selves, larger selves, more generous selves, is a world loyalty meant that your concern took you beyond self-interest, that the common good was just as important, that the self of the next moment, my next momentary self, and your next momentary self both deserve significant consideration. And I need to give your momentary self that's emerging right now, to some degree, the same standing as I give my own. That
That's
makes sense?
loyalty to loyalty. That's
Yes.
exactly loyalty to loyalty that Royce articulated so well.
Well, Royce is one of the great philosophers of America. I'm very fond of Josiah Royce. Maybe Clarence White will write a little book on Royce. You never know. We're trying to keep our brain cells active at this point of our lives, right? But yes, think about a small cell in a small nation. Um, a great nation has ideals and aspirations. And to be honest with you, none of our nations have the largest aspiration we should have, right? We should be, whether we're Canadian or US Americans, we should see the care of other countries. Well, did a steamboat just go by, or was that an elephant? Uh, we
Sounded
should
like it.
see we should see the well-being. It wasn't something I ate. We should see the well-being of other nations as significant as our own. I've spent a lot of time with resettlement of refugees, and I've come to believe that on Whiteheadian and Thurman terms, they are people who experience. They have value. They have the same value as my own grandchildren do. We're just started on a 24-hour notice sponsoring an Afghan family of 14, 11, and 7-year-old and a single mother. Uh, just a month ago, we had to really scramble and get them a place in the United States, in Washington, D.C., and Bethesda. They're the same as my grandchildren. Borders matter, borders don't matter. We are citizens of the world and not just citizens of Canada and the United States and Australia. I think those are the three countries represented here. And that's world loyalty. Thurman believes, and this beautiful statement of his, growing up in Daytona Beach. As a boy in Florida, I walked along the beach of the Atlantic, and I had a sense that all things, the sand, the stars, the sea, the night, were one lung, one breath through which all life breathed. Not only was I aware of the vast rhythm enveloping all, but I was part of it, and it was part of me. That's a powerful comment. Whitehead says it slightly different. He says something like, the world conspires to create each moment of experience or each occasion of experience. So, I'm grateful to each one of you here and how good it is to see your faces, how good it is, because you're creating me right now. And I'm creating you. And my next self and your next self are on equal standing. If I'm being the best self I can be in this moment and the most expansive self, then your life is better. And back at you, right? Good on us all. Good on us all.
Hey, Bruce, one thing I wanted to mention with that quote that you just read, it's interesting that you could say that Whitehead's use of the word conspires is
Yes.
basically breathing with.
Breathing with. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. So he's sort of saying the same thing that Thurman says about the one lung. We're all breathing with, breathing together. All life breathes together. I think Carolyn Mace says
All
that all
life
the time.
breathes together. And I think that's an important thing for us to think about. It goes beyond our partisanship. It goes beyond our nation of origin. Uh, it goes to trying to be the largest self we can be and to embrace as much of otherness as we can without losing our spiritual center. I mean, Sherry has done a great deal of good work in the area of Jungian thought, and I commend to her her book. What is process? What's it called, Sherry? I'm having a senior.
It's okay. It's called A Process Spirituality.
I thought that was what it was. You're helping me feel good tonight. A process spirituality. On the Jungian world, in some sense, the large self embraces shadow as well as light, familiarity as well as otherness. And again, difference is part of me. I've got that sort of right, don't I, Sherry?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so Americans should feel good, United States Americans and Canadian Americans. Not you're not the 51st state, Therese, by the way, but we're in North America. We're in North America. We should feel a kinship with all life on the planet. I've been reading with one of my grandchildren. I read books with my grandchildren. Sometimes it's the only way I can get them to read. They live in the digital world. Sooley, Sooley. It's a book by John Grisham. It's about a South Sudanese basketball player and whose family is basically decimated in South Sudan, and he's playing now in the United States in college ball. That the child in South Sudan is my child. The child, the mother in South Sudan is my cousin. World loyalty. A great nation, Thurman and Whitehead would say, is known by its generosity. It's known by its sacrifice at some level for good aims larger than self-interest. I think that goes back as far as Plato, and that we're supposed to be expansive in our approach. Other thoughts and questions?
Yeah, we've just got another minute or two, so if there's any remaining questions, raise your hand now.
Well, I could go on like the old Baptist preacher. I could just get started in an hour, so we could be here at 11 o'clock in Eastern time, and I'd have to tuck my friend Glenn straight to bed later on at 11. Glenn lives just a couple miles from me in Bethesda, and a good friend. Uh,
Nice.
When you say in conclusion, that means you have 30 minutes left.
Yeah, well, that's a little bit like the preacher I had visit one time when I was university chaplain at Georgetown, who said, "I'm preaching a short sermon today," and 45 minutes later he was still at it. But
Woo!
but I'll just say that to end with one statement from Thurman, which would be something Whitehead could say easily. Always there seems to be something more to be experienced, to be felt, to know. My mind rejects any conclusion as being final. The greatest source of hope, therefore, for both the present and the future is the awareness of the potential in me, in other people, and in life itself. The potential in me, in other people, in life itself, there's always something more. We need to be, for both Whitehead and Thurman, aspirational people. Aspirational people. If anything, my complaint about much of the United States politics is that there's no aspiration. It affects both of our major parties sometimes. There's no desire to be big. There's no desire to do something really great, to do something that will change the world. There's no great desire. And I think that Whitehead and Thurman remind us, and they're both passionate philosophers. Thurman says you can't do anything without passion. What God wants is people of passion. And Whitehead, of course, uses the term divine eros, the divine passion. Go forth and have passion. Go forth. Look at us there. Look at all us, that potential. I'm seeing it right now as I see the faces. The potential, the possibility, the greatness, the aspiration. Whitehead and Thurman don't let you stand where you are. They don't let you be the victim of what happened in the past. They invite you to go forth to the future. They don't want to erase the past. They want to transform the future. And let it be so. Thank you for coming tonight. It's a pleasure to be with each one of you. And again, feel free to sign up for this mystics course. It'll be a lot of fun.
For
And
Thank you.
sure.
we'll look forward to seeing you later on the trail.
Yes, and thank you so much, Bruce. Let's all show Bruce our appreciation by some kind of hand motion would probably be fine. Bruce, thank you so much. That was really great. It's so interesting to think about these two wonderful thinkers. I mean, I first read Jesus and the Disinherited when I was in my MA program in Chicago,
Yeah.
and really just was powerfully affected by that book. So I highly recommend that, as well as Bruce's book, God of the Growing Edge, about Whitehead and Thurman. And then, yeah, in the course, we begin Wednesday. That's drawing from your book, The Mystic in You, correct?
Yeah, that was the first of a series of 4 mystic books.
Yeah.
The fourth to be published someday.
Okay, very good. All right. Well, thanks again, Bruce. Thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you again at another one of our events and offerings.